Spring, 535 AD. On a small island in Lake Bolsena, in the volcanic hills of central Italy, a woman sat alone in a bath. Her name was Amalasuntha. She was roughly 40 years old. She was the daughter of Theodoric the Great, the most powerful king in the post-Roman world. She had governed Italy for nearly a decade. She had maintained functioning Roman law, Roman schools, Roman administration, in a Europe that was otherwise collapsing into illiteracy and war. 3 men entered the room. They held her head under water. She had no guards left who would stop them, no allies who could reach her in time, no leverage she hadn't already spent. Just the water, the stone walls, and 3 men following orders from a cousin she had personally placed on the throne. Within days, Emperor Justinian in Constantinople had the pretext he had been waiting for: a dead queen, a righteous cause, a war. What followed was 20 years of devastation that killed hundreds of thousands, shattered the Italian economy, collapsed the population of Rome itself, and reduced the peninsula to rubble, from which it would not meaningfully recover for centuries. Amalasuntha didn't start that war. Her murder did. This is the story of the most capable ruler in post-Roman Europe, a woman who held an entire civilization together with intelligence and will, and the men who couldn't tolerate her for either. To understand what Amalasuntha inherited, you have to understand what her father built. In 476 AD, the date historians conventionally mark as the fall of the Western Roman Empire, a Germanic warlord named Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor and simply ruled Italy himself. He kept the Roman administrative machinery running, but the fiction of a Western emperor was finished. Theodoric the Great overthrew Odoacer in 493 with the blessing of Constantinople and the swords of the Ostrogoths. Then he did something almost no one expected. He kept what he found. Theodoric's Italy was the most sophisticated polity in post-Roman Europe. Roman law functioned. Roman administrative offices operated. The Senate still met in Rome. Scholars of the caliber of Boethius and Cassiodorus served in his government. The aqueducts ran. The roads held. For 30 years, Theodoric maintained something that looked, from certain angles, almost like the old world. His genius was the balance he held. His army was Gothic. The military class that protected Italy was ethnically and culturally distinct from the civil population it governed. Romans ran the bureaucracy. Goths provided the soldiers. Theodoric sat across both worlds, fluent in both, trusted by neither entirely but feared and respected by both. It was a system that required someone extraordinary to maintain it. He had one child, Amalasuntha. He educated her like a Roman: Latin, rhetoric, philosophy, administration, the arts of diplomacy and negotiation. She was, by every account that survives, brilliant, quick, ambitious. He seems to have understood, even if he couldn't quite plan for it, that she was the most capable person in his kingdom. When Theodoric died in August 526, she was his only relevant heir. Her son, Athalaric, was 8 years old. She became regent. The balance her father had spent 30 years building would now rest entirely on her. Amalasuntha governed Italy for 8 years, and by most objective measures, she governed it well. She maintained the Roman administrative apparatus in full. She corresponded in fluent Latin with Justinian in Constantinople, who had become Eastern Emperor in 527, keeping the relationship functional and diplomatically warm. She prosecuted corrupt officials. She extended legal protections for the Roman senatorial class. She commissioned public works. She kept the peace. She also tried to do something the Gothic nobility found deeply offensive. She raised her son like a Roman. Athalaric was educated alongside Roman boys. He studied grammar, rhetoric, philosophy. Amalasuntha understood, correctly, that a Gothic king who could not navigate Roman civilization would eventually lose the Roman half of the kingdom. The administrative class, the church, the legal system, the diplomatic networks that connected Italy to the rest of the world. All of it ran on Latin literacy and Roman tradition. A king who couldn't speak that language would be dependent on men who could. The Gothic nobility understood something different. A boy raised among Roman children, reading Latin texts, learning to debate instead of fight. That was not a Goth. That was an embarrassment. They were soldiers, warlords, men who measured worth by performance in the field, and who looked at Athalaric's education and saw a future king who would be useless to them. They went to Athalaric directly, told him a real king needed real training, hunting, weapons, war, the company of fighting men. His mother was making him soft. He was Theodoric's grandson. He should act like it. Athalaric was a boy who had spent his childhood under strict maternal supervision, surrounded by tutors and expectations. He was, in other words, exactly the kind of target that men offering wine and freedom have exploited throughout all of history. He took what they offered. He began drinking, seriously, persistently, in the way of a young man trying to drown something he couldn't name. His health deteriorated visibly. He became unreliable. He became sick. Amalasuntha watched her son being destroyed in front of her. She executed 3 of the nobles she identified as most responsible. It made no difference. The process had started. She could not stop it without triggering a full Gothic revolt, and a revolt would end everything. She did what competent people trapped in impossible situations always do. She managed the damage and planned ahead. Athalaric died in October 534. He was 18 years old. His body had given out. Years of heavy drinking, likely tuberculosis, possibly other complications. He died without heirs, having never governed in any meaningful sense. Amalasuntha needed a solution immediately. There was no precedent in Gothic tradition for a woman ruling alone. The nobility was already circling. She had enemies at court who had been waiting years for exactly this moment.
She had a cousin named Theodahad. He was older, in his 50s, a Goth of royal blood with an unimpeachable genealogy. He was also, by the general consensus of everyone who knew him, physically soft, politically timid, and more interested in Neoplatonic philosophy than in governance. He had recently been embroiled in a scandal. He had been seizing farmland from Roman senators and had come to Amalasuntha for protection from the legal consequences. She assessed him and saw a tool, a figurehead, someone who would provide the Gothic legitimacy she required while she continued to hold real power. A man who owed her his position, his safety, possibly his life, and who would therefore remain dependent on her. She made him co-ruler of Italy. Then, in the same week, she did something that would prove to be her actual last mistake. She sent a private message to Constantinople, to Justinian himself. She told him she was making this appointment under duress, that she feared for her safety, that if things went wrong, she wanted his protection. She asked him to prepare a place of refuge for her. She was, in other words, simultaneously placing Theodahad on the throne and negotiating an escape route from him, hedging her bets with the most powerful emperor in the world. Either Theodahad's people intercepted those letters, or he had always intended this from the moment of the appointment. Within weeks, he moved. He accused her of plotting against the Gothic kingdom. He had her arrested. She was taken to Martana, a small island on Lake Bolsena, and held under guard. The elegant solution had been a catastrophic miscalculation. The man she had chosen because he seemed manageable had turned out to be exactly dangerous enough. The island was small. There was no way off it without Theodahad's permission. Amalasuntha was surrounded by servants who answered to him and guarded by men selected by her enemies. She wrote to Justinian again, reminded him of his promises. The diplomatic correspondence between Constantinople and Ravenna was feverish. Justinian was already considering military intervention in Italy, and a living Amalasuntha was a useful symbol, a legitimate ruler displaced by a usurper, waiting for rescue.
Whether Justinian moved too slowly on purpose, or simply moved too slowly, the answer came before any ship arrived. The relatives of the 3 Gothic nobles she had executed years earlier, the men she had removed during the regency for plotting against her, had finally obtained access to the island. In the spring of 535, they entered her bath chamber. They held her head under water until she stopped moving. When news reached Constantinople, Justinian's ambassador was in the middle of formal negotiations with Theodahad. He stood up, walked out, and sent a dispatch to the emperor. The Gothic War began within months. The war that followed should have been quick. Justinian's general Belisarius was genuinely brilliant, and the Gothic kingdom was genuinely weakened. Rome itself fell to Belisarius in 536 without a significant battle. But wars have their own momentum, and this one acquired more than most. The Goths regrouped under new leaders. Justinian sent inadequate reinforcements. The campaign stretched from months into years, then years into decades. Gothic king after Gothic king was killed or deposed, but resistance kept reforming in the north. The peninsula became a killing ground, besieged, counterattacked, burned, abandoned, besieged again. By the time the last Gothic resistance finally collapsed in 554, Italy had been destroyed. Rome had been besieged 6 times. The city's population, which had slowly recovered toward something like 100,000, fell to perhaps 30,000. The aqueducts that Theodoric and Amalasuntha had maintained were cut and broken. The farms of the countryside were abandoned. The roads were ruined. The senatorial class, the Roman administrative tradition that Amalasuntha had spent her entire career protecting, was dead or scattered. The civilization she had kept alive was killed by the war fought in her name. Justinian declared it a restoration of Roman civilization. Historians have largely accepted his framing. The Lombards invaded 15 years later and took most of what remained. History has been generous to Justinian. He gets credit for the codification of Roman law, for the Hagia Sophia, for the brief reconquest of the West. He gets to be the great restorer of Roman glory. Amalasuntha gets a paragraph, sometimes less. She was a woman who inherited a nearly impossible situation and managed it, with considerable skill, for nearly a decade. She kept functioning Roman institutions alive in a post-Roman world, a world where everything around her was fragmenting into warlordism and illiteracy. She was brought down not by a foreign invasion or a superior force, but by a boy she was trying to protect, nobles who resented her competence, and a cousin she fatally underestimated. Her mistake was the same one that kills capable people in environments built for mediocrity. She assumed that competence was its own protection, that the men around her would value what she was actually producing. They valued power. She was the obstacle to it. 3 men in a bath chamber, 4 wild horses in a field. The tools are different. The story is the same. The names we've forgotten are often the ones who were trying to hold the world together. Subscribe. We do this every week.